Hello, I'm Olivia Mattis. I hope you're having a terrific Sunday, and I'm so glad you've chosen to spend an hour of it with us. Today, unusually, instead of a film talk, we have a book talk, and we have a fabulous author. His name is Peter Eisner. He's a journalist, foreign correspondent, best-selling author, and you met him not that long ago when we had a program on the Vatican and the Holocaust. And he is the leading world's expert on the two popes of World War II, Pope Pius XI and Pope Pius XII, and in particular Pope Pius XI with his encyclical speaking out against the Nazis, that encyclical that was never delivered because of the tragic death of that Pope, and the role in that encyclical of this amazing, important hero, this American Jesuit named John Lafarge. What a story. And so we brought you Peter when we did that program a little while ago. And I was begging him to come back, and he said he had this other book, The Freedom Line. And so I'm just delighted to be bringing you him and his book today. He will be joined by his wife. That's unusual for us. We have a husband and wife as our panel. Her name is Musha Salinas Eisner, and really the genesis of this book, The Freedom Line, was their joint effort. And so they're going to tell you about that. Musha speaks many languages. She's a translator. She's a linguist. She was a translator for over 20 years for the Washington Post. She also translates in the courtroom setting, and she will tell you about her own personal history, her family history, and how this book came about. One more thing I wanted to mention is that the rescue story that we're bringing you today is one that happened just shortly after the rescue story that we honor at our foundation, the story of Aristides de Sousa Mendes, the Portuguese consul general stationed in Bordeaux, who helped all of those Jewish and non-Jewish refugees escape to freedom through out of France to Spain and Portugal. Well, our story today happens just before and just after, but along the same route, crossing all the same spots. So for me personally, it's fascinating because I've been to all these places, and this is just allowing me to deepen my own understanding of the history of what happened in those days. So without further ado, let me bring you our first speaker, and that is Mr. Peter Eisner. Peter, the floor is yours.
Olivia, thank you so much. It's a pleasure. That was very kind of you. Thank you very much. It's just a delight for me and for Musha to be here today, to be talking to you about a story very close to our hearts, the Freedom Line, which I think you'll find is very poignant at this moment. The story of a lot of young people throughout Europe that risk their lives to fight fascism and to fight for freedom. What we're going to do today is break this up into a couple of parts. And the first thing we're going to do is turn it over to Musha, who's going to give you the context in which the Freedom Line takes place, which has a lot to do with the years in Spain before the start of World War II. So let me right away turn it over to Musha, and I'll be back with you after that.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today virtually with Peter and me. My job is to set the scene for the Freedom Line, whose story is intertwined in many ways with my own. The Freedom Line is the story of a group of young people in Europe who decided to do everything they could to fight the Nazis. They banded together and formed a so-called escape line. They rescued Allied airmen shot down over Nazi-occupied territory, hid them from the Nazis, and helped them make their way through France, crossing the Pyrenees into Spain. I'm Argentinian, but my family is from Spain, specifically from the Basque Country. The Basque region encompasses part of France and part of Spain in the north on the Atlantic side. My family fled Spain as exiles from the Spanish Civil War, which took place just before World War II from 1936 to 1939. My mother and her family were from San Sebastian, which is a beautiful resort on the Bay of Biscay, very close to France. It played an important part in rescuing refugees fleeing Nazi-occupied territory during World War II. My father's family is from Bilbao, a major industrial city that also played an important part during the war. These days, maybe you've heard of Bilbao as the site of the Guggenheim Museum, which has been a very important feature in the reinvention of the city as a cultural spot. We wanted to provide you with some context about Spain during World War II. In the years before the war, Spain became a testing ground for Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. In 1936, General Francisco Franco attacked the democratically elected government of the Spanish Republic, starting a civil war that lasted 3 years. When it was over, hundreds of thousands of people were dead. You may remember Guernica, this painting by Picasso, which became one of the most emblematic paintings of the Spanish Civil War. Well, now you're going to see the way that the town of Guernica looked like after Hitler's bombing campaign in 1937. It was one of his main proving grounds for aerial bombing, and that's where the story of the Freedom Line really begins, with the air war over Europe. As you saw, Hitler's air force was crucial during the Spanish War. Franco's revolt started in Spanish Morocco, where he was a commander. He needed to transport his troops to Spain. Hitler sent his planes to do that. Historians call this the first airlift in military history. But the Basque region remained loyal to the government. And once the Civil War was lost, that anti-fascist sentiment endured. They were definitely pro-Allied during World War II. And that is why they were so important for the Freedom Line. They provided it with guides who knew all the possible shortcuts available to reach the place they wanted to go. They provided them with safe houses in Spain, which usually were farms, and where the pilots were hiding till they were delivered to the Brits. So Franco's dictatorship lasted for 30 years. Tens of thousands of people, like my parents, fled Spain, many across the Santiago Bridge, the same bridge which was going to be used later by people who were escaping the Nazis in the opposite direction during World War II. After Franco died, my parents started spending the summers in Spain. Eventually, Peter and I started going with them. One summer, we were visiting relatives on the French side, and a cousin drove us across this same Santiago Bridge. By the way, Aristides de Sousa Mendes, the namesake of this foundation, came personally to that bridge to help refugees as they escaped the Nazis. So anyway, after crossing the bridge, my cousin Rafael took us for a coffee to a hotel on the Spanish side, close to the border. He told us that that hotel was unchanged since the war, and you could really feel that in its old wooden floors, the long dusty drapes, in the squeaky staircase and the patina of the bar. It smelled of history. Rafael also said that that place had been a den of spies during World War II. He said that probably Kim Philby, the famous British spy and double agent, had been there. The place had such atmosphere that Peter and I were transported to the past. And that's when Peter said, "This is like Casablanca in the Pyrenees." And it was that, with that image and Casablanca in the Pyrenees, and the curiosity it sparked in us about that era in that particular place, that the book started. I let Peter tell you the rest of the story.
Great. Thanks, Musha. I think that one thing we have to realize is that Francisco Franco, who took over in 1939, owed his ability to win to Adolf Hitler. And he and his government were totally fascist and devoted to the Nazi cause, at least before they realized that the Nazis might lose. And at the same time, the issue was for Franco that he was not going to get any financial or food or economic aid from the Nazis, so he had to play a game. And he agreed with with Franklin Roosevelt and with Churchill to maintain himself technically neutral. The bottom line of that was that, neutral though he might not have been, there was a diplomatic representation of the Allies in Spain throughout. And that really is one of the things that helped the Freedom Line to exist. We started to find out that there were a number of escape lines. One of them eventually became known as the Comet Line. And the Comet Line was founded by a woman named Andre de Jong, codenamed Dede, in 1941. She realized that if she were able to pick up an increasing number of Allied pilots who were falling throughout occupied Nazi territory in various areas, she would be able to create a means of getting these pilots back to fight again. So many pilots were being lost that it was a necessary thing to do. Let's take a look at the map of how that worked. The pilots were British, French, and certainly mostly Americans flying out of various air bases in Britain. Their ability to get to their successful missions sometimes was very low. Getting to 25 missions before they were shot down was very hard. They knew that should they go, early in the war at least, they knew that they might not make it. But once the escape lines were put together, they had the chance that they would, in fact, survive. So this was a huge effort for the success of the war. So Dede de Jong tried the route herself, ending up one day in 1941 in Bilbao, Spain, saying to the vice consul there, Michael Cresswell, that she had a plan that she thought would work and would rescue hundreds of pilots. Cresswell listened to her, and despite the fact that there was a lot of sexism at the time and the idea that a beautiful young woman could be proposing such a thing, he went along with it. And the Comet Line, as it was known, one of the great escape lines of World War II, was created. In the course of the war, they rescued about 700 or more Allied airmen, spies, and civilians as well. But hundreds of them also were captured and many were killed. They had to contend also with spies among them that turned them in. It was a horrendous yet courageous effort. So what I wanted to do is read to you one of two brief excerpts which will describe to you Dede de Jong's life and eventually her capture too soon, to show how dangerous this really was. The thing that one has to remember is that they were constantly being sought after by the Nazis, and even when they got to Spain, it was not clear that they would be safe. Dede was a nurse from Brussels. Her parents also opposed the Nazis and fought, as did her sister also, and the others were arrested. She managed to escape and was able to set up the line by the end of 1941. And for 18 months, she was shepherding Americans and British airmen across Europe and getting them to the French-Spanish border across the Pyrenees so that they could fight another day. This particular story tells a day, unfortunately, when she was captured, January 15th, 1943. That day, she and 3 British airmen had gotten as far as the border, but the rain was so bad, the weather was so difficult that they were stuck. They didn't know what to do, and what they didn't know was that there had been a traitor among their ranks, and as a result, it was a disaster. This will give you a brief look at the book and what it was like. Freezing rain crackled on the tile roof of the farmhouse in Uruña, a French Basque village just a few miles from the Spanish border. There were 6 of them, 3 disoriented Allied pilots, Dede, and the Belgian woman, Francia, who owned the little whitewashed homestead they used as a safe house. Also Florentino, their Basque guide. Night had descended, the weather had not improved. Almost always, the escape plan was to follow the hilly trails that led to the river near the mountain hamlet of Biriatu, not 4 miles away. But their friends below said the Bidasoa River was a torrent. They could not wade across that night. Florentino paced the length of the floor. He knew the mountains. He warned her against crossing tonight. In the dark, everything was uncertain. It was too risky to move the pilots back. It was too risky to move them forward. They were trapped. Dede told Florentino she would stay with the pilots. You can go back and wait for us in Cibur. So before dawn, Florentino bundled up against the weather and walked down the path toward Cibur. Dede and Francia gave the pilots hot milk and broth, cheese and black bread. The boys were in good spirits. They expected to be going home. They huddled in the soft smell of wood and smoke at the warming stone hearth, telling stories and sharing half a cigarette. Then there was a noise and one of the trio jumped up, grasping a knife. Gestapo, he screamed. The other men laughed. They thought it was a joke. Dede did not think it was a joke. She looked out the window and she saw cars and soldiers in their gray uniforms. They barged in, pinned them against the wall, searched them for weapons, and pushed them shivering into the cold yard with the barrels of their rifles. The patrol marched Dede, Francia, and the Allied airmen for 2 hours in the rain, hands over their heads, along the road down to the Bay of Biscay. A translucent layer of frost covered the congealed mud and occasional grass along the way. They talked and walked little as they talked little and walked past Cibourg, trying to think what they could do over a little bridge to the jail in Saint-Jean-de-Luz. Dédé thought of hurling herself into the inlet, but she looked down and the rocks showed at low tide. She could only hope that the Germans would not kill them. Such was the effort, but not only by Dédé, but by so many of them to rescue pilots. Dédé had many replacements, and many of her friends tried to rescue her from prison. It was unsuccessful, and she stayed in prison for the rest of the war. More about her later. As Musha and I examined this and investigated it, we found out that there was one amazing story about a fellow named Robert Grimes, born in Portsmouth, Virginia. When he was 20 years old, he suddenly had become a pilot of a B-17, the largest bomber of its kind in the world at the moment. He found himself by early 1943 all trained and ready in England to start the bombing campaign with hundreds of other men. This next episode is from October 20th, 1943. Another amazingly harrowing moment in the story of the Freedom Line. It starts out as a very horrible day, but it ends up that the Freedom Line, that is the Comet Line, has done its work. The Freedom Line itself is really a combination of watching the people rescuing the folks of these aircraft that were falling by the dozens. And it's also the backbone of it also is this unassuming young man, Bob Grimes, who dared to fight and was unfortunately shot down in his fifth mission. This is that day, October 20th, 1943, as he was flying from England over Brussels on the way to Aachen in Germany. They'd been headed for a target in Aachen, right over the German-French border, about 300 miles due east of Snetterton Air Base in England. He took off at dawn. Within 15 minutes or so, Bob saw the European coast in the distance. And just about then, he had trouble. The supercharger on engine number 4 was malfunctioning. As the engine lost power, it overheated and the propeller turned more slowly, acting as an air brake. The rest of the planes in his air wing were still climbing, but Bob was starting to fall back. A minute or two later, at least 6 German FW-190s were coming right at his plane from all directions. Head on, one fighter was visible at the windshield, its guns looking like flashing semaphore as it fired directly at him. Bob dipped one wing and looked for clouds to hide in. Guns were spinning in their cradles as the German fighters looped in and out at them. The machine guns were blazing and the plane buffeted and jolted as Bob aimed for a low patch of clouds. Suddenly, a 20-millimeter shell had hit the inside cowling of the number 2 engine next to his seat, had broken in half and ricocheted end over end through the fuselage and cut through Bob's flight suit, slicing his quadriceps. Though wounded, Bob shook his head clear. He pulled back on the stick to keep the plane up, but it wasn't going to work. Crew, he called, abandon ship, get out, he called, and he hit the microphone switch along with the emergency bailout alarm just as they had drilled. He started counting slowly to 120, the number of seconds it should take the 9 men under his command to strap on their chutes and get out of the plane. Bob didn't remember squeezing down the flight deck, last out of the plane. He didn't remember the wind blowing through the hatch in the fuselage. He was sucked into the sky, and there was a torrent against his face and the rushing of air in his ears that hurled him end over end. And then it was suddenly quiet, calm, and he was plunging through air, mouthing words that were taken by the wind. Heaven, he thought. This must be heaven. He saw the clouds and the dome of the sky. There was silence, no longer the splatter of metal and the ringing of the engines, his nose clear from the burn of his oxygen mask. Any reveries were interrupted, though, as he pulled down on one side of the chute to take the pain off of the pressure on his crotch. Helplessly, all he could do was look down and see the field, and a road and two figures, maybe animals moving along, stopping. Then he saw there were people, and they had bicycles. Time sped up on him. He tumbled to the ground, crawled on all fours to gather and unhook his chute. The parachute brought him down near a road, and the man and the boy came running. And then he heard the barking dogs. It was a wrench in his stomach. Dogs were hunting for him. The Germans were coming after him. Now, it seemed like there would have been no rescue for Bob Grimes, but there was. The escape line, the Comet Line, was waiting for him. There was a tremendous swell of bravery, even among the farmers in a place like that, who dared shepherd somebody like Bob Grimes to their barn and hide him for the night. If the Germans had found him, they would have killed Bob and killed them as well. But they didn't. They reached out to the Comet Line, and they were able to get Bob along the road that months later would take him to safety. The first person that he encountered was a woman named Micheline Dumont. Micheline, whose codename was Lily, helped in the rescue of hundreds of Allied airmen. She protected and sheltered Bob after his plane crashed, and was able to find a doctor in Brussels who would actually dare to operate on Bob while the Nazis were even measuring every suture and every bit of ether that they might try to use to anesthetize someone. The doctor operated without ether. Bob said it was the worst thing he'd ever experienced. Brought him back to their safe house, and the rest of the fall, Micheline, codenamed Lily, nursed Bob back to health. When he finally was healthy, Micheline checked in with the next person that Dédé had, in fact, recruited to work with the escape line. His name was Jean-Francois Nothomb. His codename was Franco. And he'd worked with Dédé and he'd worked with Lily all along the escape line. And he was the one that would meet Bob at the border of Belgium and France, and then shepherd him in the first week in December, first by secondary trains, then by bicycles, sometimes by hay truck, sometimes just walking, until in mid to late December, they arrived in southernmost France, close to the Pyrenees, and ready to try to get Bob and others together to cross over the mountains and cross the Bidasoa River into Spain. There they relied on a number of mountain guides. Perhaps one of the most folkloric was Florentino Goicoechea. He was a tough guy. He was a smuggler. He was not unlike many of the tough Basque men that lived in the mountains of the Basque country. Florentino and others knew the routes, knew the paths, knew how to evade the Nazis, and were able to bring people to safety, like Bob. So then, finally, on December 23rd, 1943, Bob, accompanied by a bunch of other pilots, by Jean-Francois, and even one French spy, hiked over the hills in the Pyrenees, in the snow, assuming they were being sought by the Nazis, down to the banks of the Bidasoa River and crossed. Not everybody survived that night. Bob did survive. And as soon as he got up on the shore, no later than arriving, there was a flashlight in his eyes, and Spanish soldiers arrested him. The problem was that, as we said, France was one thing, but Spain was still controlled in many ways by fascist forces, where the military, some trained by the Gestapo, might be willing to turn somebody back to the Nazis. So there kicked in our friend Michael Cresswell, who typically was able to bribe Spanish guards if the pilots were captured, or to shepherd them if they were free and were able to contact them, shepherd them to a series of safe houses on the Basque side, and then eventually get them to Bilbao, which still was not easy. In Bob's case, he was arrested. He was ransomed out by Cresswell. Cresswell got him to Bilbao, and some days later, they were able to smuggle him to Gibraltar in the trunk of a car, Gibraltar still being English territory and forever, where from then he was able to get back to England and fight another day. So that really, in summation and quickly, is the way we describe the Freedom Line through the eyes of these brave young people and Bob Grimes, who along the course of his crash landing and recovery from a serious wound made it back thanks to this intrepid group of young people, many of them women. For Musha and me, it was really a labor of love, I have to say. In the course of doing our research, we met some of these people still with us. On the right, you'll see Lily. Years later, in 2004, on a reconstruction of the escape line one day, and there her sister Nadine, who also was part of the escape line. We were delighted to see that many of these people joined together and were willing to share their experiences with us. Some were not with us. Dede survived the terrible beatings that she received, and she was liberated from a concentration camp at war's end. And by 1946, the pilots that had called Dede their angel of mercy was recognized by England and was called to Buckingham Palace, where King George VI gave her the George Medal for her heroism. She lived a long life, but later in life, she had suffered so much from the beatings that it started to take her toll. So it's told. By the time that I would have wanted to speak to her, she really couldn't speak to anyone, which was a great tragedy for everyone. But there's one person among others that we were able to meet and become friends with, who was Bob Grimes. Bob, it turned out, lived no more than 20 minutes from Musha and me in suburban Virginia. And once we introduced one another, we became fast friends. And over months, he told me this story of his rescue, probably for the first time, because he thought, after he was rescued in 1944, that, well, he was told that this was top secret, never speak about it. And he never heard that anybody said that he could start speaking about it. But finally, in the 2000s, he thought nothing would happen. So we told his story for the first time, and he was proud, and we were delighted to become his friends. Bob passed away in 2010 at the age of 87, and of course we miss him. That is really our story. As I said in the beginning, I think from looking at an effort by young people and freedom-loving people that were willing to risk their lives to save others and also to protect their own independence, that system could not be more poignant and more appropriate for the moment we're living. So with that, thanks very much for listening, and we'd love to hear questions from you.
Great. Well, questions have been pouring into the chat box, and I've been collecting them. So I'm looking forward to posing them to you. Right now, we're going to just take a brief pause to talk about our upcoming program, which is this very important program we have going next week on a hero that you may not have heard of, named Shmuel Artur Ziegelboim. We have the world's expert on this man, who is Judd Newborn, who'll be speaking about him next week. We also have a film that's going to have its US premiere, so that will be quite the opportunity. And I'm now going to hand the floor to Judd to explain to you a little bit of what he has in store for you next week. Judd.
Hi, everybody. I'm about to tell you, next week I will be telling you a miraculous story. There's tragedy to it, but there's also a message of inspiration, dynamism, and resilience. And that's the note on which it ends. The story is about Shmuel Artur Ziegelboim, but it's actually what I call a postmodern Hasidic tale of the Holocaust, because I'm going to bring together, in a rather poetic way and literary way, I'm going to bring together three seemingly separate stories that, as in a Hasidic tale, miraculously come together by the end. So you hold on and you wonder, will these come together? And the story will be very personal, partly about me, then about Shmuel Ziegelboim, who was a charismatic and dynamic representative of the Jewish people of Poland through his membership in the Polish government in exile. He did everything he could to try and alert the world to the mass murder of Europe's and especially Poland's Jews. And that effort ultimately led to a tragic end when he felt he had accomplished nothing and had lost his wife and child in the Warsaw Ghetto. However, I made a discovery in the course of doing this program, this story, about someone who he had left behind, who survived and became something very special. I don't want to tell you now, but it's someone who ultimately affirmed his life, her own life, and the resilience of the Jewish people. So there's a lot of miraculous stuff going on in this story. And I use the Hasidic metaphor, even though Shmuel was a Bund socialist. So it's really an inspiring story.
I think we have a few slides, so maybe let's just go through them real quick.
Well, that's just me when I do this program to the public in person. And this is an image of Shmuel Ziegelboim as a young man when he was getting together his great activism for the Jewish people of Poland as a Bund socialist member. And there's a little Hasidic image from Chagall. And how do you pull together the Bund member who is a socialist and a Hasidic story? Well, this is just to show you our Hasidic theme. And please move on. There'll be music, by the way, too. Inspiring music at the beginning and the end. That's Shmuel Ziegelboim in his dynamic role as in Poland itself before they spirited him out of the Warsaw Ghetto so that he could become the voice of Polish Jewry. And next, we see the fact that Ziegelboim, in fact, although a Bund socialist, was born in the shtetl of Chelm. Chelm, of course, is the town that is also the basis for the stories of the wise men of Chelm, the folk tales of those foolish and wonderful wise men who think they're wiser than anyone else and always become the victims of their own folly. The next slide. Ziegelboim sent telegrams, which I discovered. All of this material from Ziegelboim I discovered at the museum at EVO for the Museum of Jewish Heritage, and we made it into a permanent part of the core exhibition. And this is a telegram in which he's trying to wake up the entire world to the annihilation of Poland's Jews. And the next slide is the fact that the third story is going to bring us right up into joy. and a message of resilience. And I can't tell you exactly how that comes about because it's a surprise. And that's our story. I think we have a clip that will give you part of the Ziegelbäum story in its core.
Shmuel Mordechai Ziegelbäum, member of the Polish National Council.
Shmuel Artur Ziegelbäum, Jewish Workers' Bund leader, representative to the Polish Parliament in exile, took his life in protest at the world's indifference to Nazi extermination of the Jews.
Panie prezydencie, panie premierze, pozwalam sobie kierować do panów ostatnie moje słowa, a przez panów do rządu i społeczeństwa polskiego, do rządów i narodów państw sprzymierzonych, do sumienia świata. Za murami getta odbywa się ostatni akt niebywalej w dziejach tragedii. Milczeć nie mogę i żyć nie mogę, gdy giną reszty ludu żydowskiego w Polsce. Towarzysze moi w getcie warszawskim zginęli bronią w ręku w ostatnim porywie bohaterskim. Nie byłoby dane zginąć tak jak oni, ale należę do nich i do ich grobów masowych. Życie moje należy do ludu żydowskiego w Polsce, więc je oddaję.
Okay.
Shmuel Ziegelbäum thought he had not saved anyone, but in fact, he saved my own life. And that's through the charismatic energy and the discovery of his artifacts. And I'll tell you more about that next week.
And I can't wait. And I hope everyone will sign up. It is a paid program where we are asking people to purchase tickets through Eventbrite. However, we have a sponsor. So if cost is at all an issue, just send us an email with a subject line, need a ticket, and we will make sure that you get in. So thank you, Judd. And now let's go back to today's program where we have a flood of questions. And of course, the first question, which you could have anticipated, Peter and Musha, is where's the film? How come there's no film yet?
Well, that's a great question. I've heard that before. It's a long process. We're still hoping and we're still waiting. And if any of you have a producer in mind or in California and know somebody, we're ready. It's been considered. A lot of times it's too expensive to make. So we stand by, but it feels like a film to almost everybody that reads the book. It's true.
So the question was, where were the Americans? So these people were spirited to Spain. They were then helped by the British. But what about the Americans? Were they involved?
It's a very interesting question. And I think it's a familiar question as well. The United States was divided over what the greater enemy was, the Nazis or the communists. And there were a lot of pro-Franco, quietly pro-Nazi people in the United States who were holding back Franklin Roosevelt's ability to operate in some ways. Roosevelt appointed a pro-Franco university professor named Carlton Hayes as the US ambassador to Spain because he thought he would be friendly enough with Franco to not get Franco to bolt and go over to the Nazis. So what that meant was that the US embassy position was stay away from these escape lines who are rescuing pilots. Anyway, they're probably communists that are doing it. It was outrageous. Some of the American younger diplomats got around it and worked with Michael Creswell. But it's a shocking thought, and I really also think that it reminds one once again of the insanities of red state versus blue state that you hear about these days.
So there's a question about the mechanics of the operation. So how did the farmers and the local people know to approach a pilot who was shot down? Did they wait for such events? Did they find them on the road if one fled from a failed aircraft? How did it work?
Well, there were a number of ways. One was, first of all, that if the German planes were based all over Belgium and Holland and France and such, so it's likely that these planes had taken off with a great roar going after the B-17s, and there was flak being shot at the B-17s. So anybody in the countryside would know what was going on. They would hear it. And you would see the parachutes coming down. They would see the pilot, and sometimes it was a race to be able to either hide the pilots or for the pilots themselves to ditch their parachutes and find someplace to hide until dark, until they themselves could get to a hiding place. And word of mouth being what it was, once you could get to a farmer, the farmer probably knew the parish priest had a contact with the escape line. And that's the way it was. That's how it happened with Bob.
If I may add, I think that the way these networks could operate actually was, at least in the Basque Country, was with the complicity of the whole population in a way. The whole Basque population was completely repressed by Franco. Franco was the ally of Hitler, so they felt that Hitler was their enemy, and they were pro-Allied, and they were ready to help the pilots as much as they could. And I think that in the countryside, you kind of know everything through the grapevine, as you say. And they had to be careful to hide all that from the police, the Franco police, who was pervasive, and it was everywhere. So I think that the population, the whole population, helped in a way.
So Musha and Peter, I know that you recreated this Exodus route yourself in the research for this book. What was that like for you?
Well, I'll let Musha speak as well. For both of us, for me, it was just amazing that we could actually go on the same route that Bob Grimes had followed 60 years earlier. The mountain paths used by the Basque shepherds and the Basque smugglers are still there. You could smell the history as we did that. We joined with a group of other people, including some of the children of some of the members of the Comet Line, on a crossing that took us up and around boulders and mountains, down and up, and finally getting to the banks of the Bidasoa River, which is the sometimes gentle and sometimes torrent of a river that very close to the Atlantic Ocean. It empties into the Atlantic Ocean, where we actually waded across the river and went up the other side and continued going to some of the safe houses that Musha also described on the Spanish Basque side. It was a remarkable experience for us.
I have to say that doing that was very important for Peter as a writer, because the book is nonfiction. The book is a real story, and every single detail that you'll find in the book is real. If it says that night there was a full moon, this has been researched, and that night there was a full moon at the time. So getting the getting the scene, getting the smells, getting the atmosphere, getting the nature that surrounded these people. I think it's very important for a writer to be able to describe that in the book.
And it's interesting, someone in the audience says that the film is right there in your head while reading this great book. So that's, of course, a testament to Peter's great writing. So,
That's
but
great.
there still should be a movie, despite that.
We agree.
So there are many other questions. There is a contemporary question. It's a big question having to do with Ukraine and Putin, and whether you see parallels with Ukraine perhaps being Putin's testing ground today. I don't know if you want to venture into that.
Well, just to say that the parallel has been made. You know, when at the start of World War I, Hitler invaded Poland, and his reasoning was that, well, he invaded Czechoslovakia, and his reasoning was that great parts of Czechoslovakia were German speaking. It really should be a German country, and those people want to be Germans, and they're being put down by the Czechs and such. Well, it sounds very familiar to Putin saying that, well, Crimea and Donbass, these are really Russian provinces, and we have to take them back. The question is, for everyone, what is that proving ground, and what happens if you don't answer the call to fight for the freedom of determination, whether it be Czechoslovakia, whether it be Poland in World War II, or any of Western Europe, or Ukraine right now? So I agree with that.
Here's a great question. Were there any love connections established between some of these pilots and their rescuers?
Oh, I love that question. And yes, with more time, we would tell more about it. Take a look again. Think about, I don't know if we can call it back up. Think about again that picture of 20-year-old Bob Grimes and that picture of Lily, this lovely young woman, and who's for 2 months is nursing Bob back to health. Well, I spoke to both of them about that, and they were very circumspect. They both had been married for 60 years and were very happily married and had children and grandchildren. But war is war, and were there a film version of it, I think that it wouldn't be too far to go to say that they liked each other a lot.
Well, so this is kind of a related question, and that is, these rescuers, they were young. Were they single? So did they not have families? Is that how they were able to do this heroic work? I mean, tell us more about these rescuers and how it was possible for them to even think to do such a thing.
In the case of the Comet Line, many of them were not even 20 years old. And they made themselves look younger. As far as I asked Jean-Francois Nothomb Franco about that. He had not been married at the time. Dede was not married. They were quite young, and but among the Basque guides and among some of the people at the safe houses, they certainly had families. They certainly risked everything and risked immediate murder by the Nazis should they be found, and they didn't care. They said that some things are higher than worrying about personal safety. And in the case of many of these young people, they said, you know, as far as love and marriage are concerned, we'll put that off to another day. We have important business to take care of now. And I think that all of them said that.
Now, I'm curious to know more about remembrance and whether these people have been properly honored. I mean, what has been done to honor individual members of this group, and should more be done? And if so, what?
That's
Well,
another, go ahead, Mush.
No, I was just going to say that that crossing of the Pyrenees that starts on the French side, but you know, in some towns that were the old hiding places, and so you follow the track that they did, and they wait for you in each safe house with wine and cheese, and then you follow, and then you go onto the Spanish side, and the same thing happens there. So that is done every year as a remember all these people, and many of their relatives take part in this, and it's really moving. But you know, it's a little bit at a local level. I don't know if there are more things done in a bigger way. Maybe Peter knows.
I was outraged initially to find out that while Dédé and Jean-Francois and Lily and many of the others were honored with medals and cheered by the Brits, but after the war, the United States still focusing on right wing versus left wing. You know, we have to try to contain the possibility of any other Western European countries going under the sway of the communists, such as they saw it. They almost disregarded totally the heroism of these escape lines, the heroism of Dédé, who was never recognized as she should have been by the U.S. government, of Lily and all of the others. And it's a terrible lapse, and I still think that it should be answered.
So, Peter, it seems that you specialize in unearthing unknown, major important stories that we never knew about World War II, which is an event that's highly researched and that a lot has been written on. I don't know how you do it, but kudos to you.
Well, thanks. It's the reason I'm doing it. Part of the reason that I've done it is I feel that by telling these World War II stories, I've done 3 books and 1 long article about it. I think it gives everyone a chance to consider issues of facing moral decisions. These stories are on the periphery of the larger story, but it's asking then and now, how would you react and how should you react faced with a challenge to the world that deserves to be answered? That's really what this was about for me.
So we're getting to the end of the hour, and I just wonder if you have some final parting words you want to say to our audience, maybe starting with Musha. Are there any final thoughts you would like to share?
Sure. Well, what I like to say is that Peter has written several books, but of all of them, this is the one that means the most to me. And you could say that it's because it connects with my roots, but it's not only that, it's because of what we've said before. You know, just every time I think of the courage of these young, very young people, 18, 19, 20s, from different nationalities, Spanish, American, French, Belgian, and their clarity of mind and their lack of hesitation to fight fascism, it deeply moves me every time I think about them. And when we were interviewing Lily, I asked her, you know, weren't you scared? And she said, yeah, many times I was scared. And didn't you think that maybe you should be doing something else instead of doing this? And she said, no, this is what you did. I never hesitated. And I think it's admirable, especially in these days when the struggle goes on.
Peter, the last word goes to you.
Well, I think Musha said it very poignantly. There are parallels with what we go through in life, and I think that there are truths at a moment when people question what is real and what is not real, that we can see in these stories, which is why I do them. Let me say one other final thing that some people have asked for my email. Happy to share that with anyone who wants it. It's peisner@gmail.com, peisner@gmail.com. And just once again to say, it's just our absolute pleasure to tell this story that means so much to us. And Musha and I, as you can see, felt in this to be sharing something very important. So we're happy to share it with you, and thanks very much.
What a power couple you are. How wonderful that you did this together, and how wonderful that you brought us into your world. So thank you for bringing us this story. Thank you for your compelling presentation. And of course, thank you to our audience. I encourage you all to come see us again next week. And in the weeks to come, you will get an email after today's program with all the information you need. So have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody. Be well. Bye-bye.